Good morning. We're back in the studio with Andrew Paquette. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning, Fanta.
We're going to carry forward from our kind of introduction video and talk about the validation of dreams, the validation of how you've gone about creating a framework to not necessarily to prove, but to make sure that what you're working on is founded in logic and with a process. Um, it's difficult at times to me. It's like you talk about issues of spirituality, you talk about issues of these other dimensions, and it's important to me. Your validation process is really important. So I'd like to have you kind of take that on as a topic if possible.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I'll start with how I learned to do it, and then I'll give you some ideas of how it's done now that I know how. This is just so people have a way of recognizing in their own dreams what it feels like to get it wrong, and then how to understand how to get it right, if that makes any sense. And of course, I'm keeping in mind the fact that there's a large assumption there, and that is that my dreams would be have commonalities with other people's. I think that is true, but nevertheless, it remains an assumption. So the way it started was, as I told you in the previous interview, I did not believe that my dreams really were psychic, as my wife was telling me. It didn't make sense to me. So what I decided to do to prove her wrong was to keep records of them in a dream journal. Now, the reason I chose this as the method was because I didn't remember exactly what I had told her. So when she was saying, you said this, and this just happened, and therefore that's a dream of the future, I couldn't say, well, I know for a fact that you got that wrong, because I couldn't point to any kind of written record that would say so one way or the other. So what I wanted to do is create that written record. Now, initially I assumed that if I was lucky, I'd go like 2 years and I'd get one dream that would be similar somehow in a very generic way to an event. So I was really looking at this as something that I'd do until I got bored and she gave up, something like that. But what happened instead was that right away the dreams were connecting to things that were happening later on in the day. Now, um, what I found was that it was really easy to report something incorrectly. Okay, so I'll give you an example of one of those. Um, I had this dream where I recorded that there were massive food riots in a Latin American country, and there were 50,000 people waiting to get into a McDonald's. Okay. Now, what I actually dreamed was a little bit different from that. What it was is I saw 50,000 people crowded outside of McDonald's, and I saw a revolution in a Latin American country, but the McDonald's was in Moscow. Now, when I woke up and I was writing that down, I was thinking, I was trying to figure out how to reconcile Moscow with a Latin American country. Couldn't figure out how to do it, so I wrote it down as being in the Latin American country, and I mixed the two scenes, which I really shouldn't have done. So then what happened is later in the day, or in the evening actually, about 12 hours later, I was watching the evening news, and they had a news story about a revolution in Panama. And then right after it, the very next story was the opening of the very first McDonald's in Moscow, and they had a crowd of 50,000 people outside. So I had mixed those two elements. And one thing I thought was really great about looking at my dream journal is that because I was taking notes, very, very careful notes, it was possible to compare to these later events and see where the mistakes got made, which made it easier to not make those mistakes anymore. As a result of spotting that particular error, I became very careful about writing down exactly what I saw instead of trying to interpret what it actually meant or what it was. And if I saw two things like Latin American country and Moscow, I wouldn't try to figure out the answer to that problem while I was writing it down. I just write it down and I let it work itself out, which is a really major step forward. But some of the earlier ones that made me feel more comfortable with this were like I had a dream about winning lottery numbers, where although, I'm sorry, I had a dream about losing lottery numbers, but it included some winning lottery numbers. In that particular case, enough numbers came through in the dream that were correct that I knew the odds against that dream happening were very, very high, even though they were still lower than if I had won the lottery. So it was that kind of thing that really got my attention. So what happened was I started writing them down. I started noticing mistakes, and when I noticed the mistakes, I tried to define what kind of mistake it was. Another kind of mistake, if I was dreaming about somebody else in a remote location, I had a tendency to try to include myself in the scene. I felt like I was really there, which makes sense if it's an out-of-body experience, as I later understood it to be. So let's just say let's see, what's an example? Okay, I had a dream about my friend Richard Breeden out in Japan, and I was trying to talk to him in the dream. And he ignored me, naturally, because he couldn't see me. But I got irritated, so I would yell at him, saying, "Come on, listen to me, I'm right here." And I got quite angry. In any event, so I write down this dream, and including me being upset with him. And then I call him up, and he's able to verify everything except for all the stuff that involved me being there. So at that point, I know, okay, wait a minute. If I'm dreaming about somebody who ignores my presence, and it's somebody I know, it's quite likely an out-of-body experience, and all the material relating to my presence there and any communications I'm trying to have with the person are probably something that that person can't verify. It may actually be real. It may be that I was there and I was really seeing him and I was really trying to interact, but he can't verify it. Therefore, for validation purposes, I have to ignore that. So that kind of information came out when I was checking these things. And it really taught me a great deal about why people can feel that it's not possible to validate dreams. Because there are certain kinds of mistakes that happen that can make you feel that you're on the wrong track, or that dreams are just a fantasy that have no meaning. Like, for instance, I have an uncle named Tom Paquette, and this friend of mine I just mentioned named Richard are, in my mind, they're very similar to each other. I don't mean as personalities, but their relationship to me is very similar. They're like best friends. And I would oftentimes dream of, like, say, Richard, and in the dream I would think it was Tom, or I'd dream about Tom and I would think it was Richard. And I found out that the way to tell the difference between the two is where they were located. So if I felt like I was in Japan, it was Richard. If I felt like I was in Florida, it was Tom, because that's where they each lived. So sometimes I'd have to use logic to figure that kind of thing out. But once I did that, I found it was quite easy to verify the dream, because then I could call Tom and I could say, "Tom, does this list of items make sense to you for yesterday or last night?" And he normally would say yes, and he would tell me what the exact situations were that I was describing. The same thing goes for Richard. Um, so that actually is very important to be able to learn what kind of mistakes you make. Now, importantly, a misidentification error, that's what I was just describing. In my case, anyway, they tend to be very consistent. So I never think of Tom as being anyone other than Richard, and vice versa. And there are a couple other people I get mixed up like that, but I never mix them up with anyone else. It's always only with one other person, and there's only three people I do this with, or three pairs of people, I should say. But there are a number of other kinds of errors. Another has to do with the fact that in dreams, it's very hard for me to notice what the function of an object is. It's much easier to see the object. So I've got like a little circular floss container here. Let's see, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, in a dream, I might see that I'm holding this thing that's like a flattened white egg. And that might be how I think of it. I might not realize that it's something that I can open and I can pull floss out and I can floss my teeth with, because the function part of its identity is lost to me in a dream. I'm only looking at it. And this is something that's actually very important to me, because when validating these things, it's important to know the level of awareness that you have within the dream. And I find that at the very lowest level of awareness is strangely enough where I have it's easiest to validate the dreams. So when I don't know what things are, but I can see them, and this is all when it's very physically oriented, then I can go ahead and compare that with later events or things happening in other people's lives, and generally get them validated. But if I'm at a higher level of awareness where things are clearer and I do understand function, that generally happens when a spirit guide is present in the dream or something like that, and they're showing me something else that's much more important than anything that would be happening in the physical locale or environment. And what happens then is I'm not looking at things that can be verified at all, and so I can't get much validation. But on the other hand, I have a higher quality dream. So ironically, as I look at it, the lowest quality dreams that I have are actually the ones that are easiest to verify. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm wondering, in your book, let's bring up your book here. In your book, Dreamer, 20 Years of Psychic Dreams and How They Changed My Life, do you cover these issues of validation? Do you talk?
Yes, I do.
So this
Yeah, I do.
it's a good place for people to start in terms of understanding. Well, you start with your logging, and then you take a look at these kind of fundamentals of validation.
Yeah, and I would say the first several chapters are fairly rich with detail as far as the kind of things, the kind of errors that I would run into, the kind of solutions I would find to those errors, the improvements in the reportage, and how other people can improve the reportage of their own dreams. One very important realization I made early on is that common sense wisdom on the subject of symbols, I just had to throw completely out the window, because I found out symbols are very specific communications to me from an external source. They really couldn't be described as something that's coming from within, and it was very easy to show that with the way things are being validated. But that's a subject for a different interview.
I
So
think that's a good point to bridge across here to our next interview. We'll sign off of this one, and I'll join you in a few minutes for the next one.
perfectly
Thank
fine.
you for your time
Thank you.
today.
Mhm.